Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, non-resident fellow with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is March 17th, 2020, and I'm delighted to be here with Khaled Elgindy and Elizabeth Tsurkov. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs MEI's program on Palestine and Israel-Palestine affairs. He's the author of the book Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. Elizabeth Tsurkov is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a research fellow at the Forum for Regional Thinking. She's also a PhD student at Princeton's Department of Politics. Her work focuses on the Syrian civil war, Iraq, Israel-Palestine, and movements for social change in the Middle East. Thanks so much to both of you for being with us. Elizabeth, I wanted to start with you and ask you to kind of lay out the different pressures, political pressures that the Israeli government faces in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and help explain why they have responded not with a full-throated denunciation of Russia, but with seeming to try to find some middle path, now including this mediation effort.
Right. So Israel, on the one hand, perceives itself as part of the so-called West, and obviously the U.S. Is a security guarantor for Israel and its major ally. So it wants to be in line with the Western position, which backs the Ukraine against the Russian invasion. But at the same time, Israeli officials mention again and again that Israel neighbors on Russia, and they mean Russian presence in Syria. Israel has a solid relationship with Russia and is loath to harm that relationship to kind of be more in line with the Western position. And this is why it adopted this kind of a position that differs from the Western one of trying to mediate, but Ukrainian officials accuse Israel of essentially adopting the Russian position. We know that many countries around the world lit buildings in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. In Israel, the walls of the old city of Jerusalem were lit with the colors of both Russian flag and Ukrainian one, as if there is some kind of equal standing for the invader and the actor that is resisting a force invading their country. So Israel is trying to kind of adopt a middle position, but is struggling to do so at the moment.
Elizabeth, can you talk a little bit about when Israel says that its borders on Russia and it's concerned about Russian influence in Syria? What exactly is it that Israel is doing vis-a-vis Syria, maybe Lebanon too, that it's concerned about Russia's response to?
Right. So when Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war more directly in 2015, many Israeli officials were relieved. They believed that Russia will serve as a check on Iranian influence in Syria, and therefore worked very hard to maintain a good relationship with the Russian military that is present in Syria, as well as the Kremlin. Russia essentially is allowing Israel to carry out Israel has carried out thousands of airstrikes in Syrian territory against Iranian-linked targets, Hezbollah-linked targets in Syria. And this is done basically with Russian acquiescence. And at times it even appears Russian satisfaction to an extent, because it diminishes Iranian influence in Syria, benefiting Russia in this regard. So Israel is very keen to maintain this green light from Russia, and therefore is loath to provide any kind of support to the Ukraine. For example, there were reports that U.S. wanted Israel to sell drones to Ukraine. Israel has sold drones to multiple countries around the world, quite nefarious regimes as well, including the Azerbaijani regime, and yet it refused to do so in the case of Ukraine to fend off this Russian invasion.
Khaled, I'm curious what you make about the way the Israeli government has responded to Russia's invasion, and also what the U.S. response has been to Israel's response.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I'm not terribly surprised that the Israelis are trying to stake out this middle gray area in between, they're not in a position, I think, where they can issue a full-throated condemnation of Russia's invasion the way Western European countries have, just for the reasons that Elizabeth already pointed out. I think it's not that surprising. Also, there is a very large Russian-speaking population in Israel, and there are longstanding, cultural and other family ties with people both in Russia and in Ukraine. So I can understand on the surface why the Israelis would try to stake out that position, but it's a bitter pill for Washington to swallow, and I think we've heard the administration express, albeit in some somewhat subtle ways, their disappointment in the position that Israel has staked out. But we've even heard from Congress members who are typically quite uncritical of Israel, but we've heard some pretty strong words from people like Lindsey Graham, for example, that this is kind of an unacceptable situation. I'm paraphrasing; those aren't his words, but that he would get on the phone with his Israeli counterparts or people in the Israeli government to express their dissatisfaction with the Israeli position. So, I think it clearly underscores the. There's a myth in Washington political and policy circles that American and Israeli interests are almost one and the same, and clearly that's not the case. It's not the case with regard to the Palestinians and others in the region, but it's certainly not the case in broader geopolitical terms, and that's being highlighted, I think, in this moment.
Yeah, it seems to me in a situation of, as we move from a kind of unipolar to a period of great power competition, it seems to me that the possibilities for those divergences are even greater, given that the U.S. will push all of its allies to take a hardline and anti-Russian and anti-Chinese stance as it does, and that Israel may not always be on board with that. Elizabeth, I'm curious about your thoughts. Khaled mentioned the question of internal domestic politics in Israel. Given the fact that Israel has a large population from the former Soviet Union, but also just in general, how is this Israeli position of semi-neutrality, is it popular, or are there strong kind of criticisms?
No, so generally, both in terms of media coverage and my conversations with people around Israel, the position generally is very empathetic to Ukraine. The coverage of, the flight of refugees, the horrible bombings that have happened, receives, front page coverage, around the clock coverage. So there's a great deal of empathy with Ukrainians. There is also often kind of this very odd discourse of, the Russian invasion proves that we need to be strong. Kind of, there's this perception that Ukraine's fate is would have been Israel's fate if Israel didn't have a strong military, that we, have to have a strong military to defend ourselves. Look what happened to Ukraine. They disarmed themselves of nuclear weapons. They didn't invest enough in militarizing their society, and this is the result. But so overall, I would say that there's a great sense of solidarity. There were also several protests in solidarity with Ukraine, and also there's been an outpouring of support to the thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have arrived in Israel in recent weeks, with people from all walks of life, looking for ways to donate money, SIM cards, food, clothes to those arriving, often with very little, because they literally fled from under the bombs with just a single suitcase.
Since you mentioned it, Elizabeth, maybe you could say something about what Israel's policies are towards Jewish and non-Jewish people fleeing Ukraine, and because I know you've had some personal experience working with Ukrainian refugees who don't have the right to return to enter Israel under Israel's law of return.
Right. So I happen to be in Israel. I'm generally not based here, but I happen to be here over the past week and served as a translator from Hebrew to Russian and vice versa for a member of Knesset, Ibtisam Mar'ana, who visited the refugees both at the Dan Panorama Hotel, where they are being held, and as well as detention facilities at the Ben Gurion airport. And the treatment of refugees fleeing Ukraine is very different depending on whether the individuals are Jewish or not. Whereas Jewish refugees are welcomed, are provided with financial support. Even the COVID tests at the airport are covered. Their flights are covered. They really are welcomed and made to feel at home. Israeli officials have come to greet them, to welcome them, to make them feel at home. Those who are not Jewish, thus far, Israel has welcomed several thousand of such refugees, but they are not given refugee status. They are also not told that they can apply for, request asylum and then go through the process, which in Israel is deeply, deeply flawed. But they're not even presented with this option. Oftentimes, the Israelis who invited these refugees to come and stay with them have to essentially post bail, kind of a guarantee that these individuals will return to their country. And sometimes they're held in detention and even deported in cases where they previously stayed in Israel. For example, individuals who fled the war on Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014 arrived in Israel, requested asylum, were eventually rejected and left the country. Those individuals are held in detention. Those are the types of individuals whom I visited along with MK Mar'ana. And several of these individuals have already been deported. They're deported back to the airports from which they arrived. So, Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, etc.
Khaled, I can imagine that Elizabeth was talking about an Israeli Jewish narrative among some Israeli Jews about the way that the war in Ukraine furthers a Zionist narrative, that Jews need a state, it needs to be able to protect itself. I imagine that for many Palestinians, the lessons of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then Israel's response to it are seen in a very, very different light. First of all, I wanted to get your thoughts on it seems to me there's a certain irony in the fact that it's almost taken for granted that Israel's justification for not opposing Russia's violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine is, well, we need to be violating the sovereignty of Syria, right? There seems to me that irony seems to be often. Now, Israel obviously has its own justifications for doing that, which may not be exactly the same as Russia's, but that's one irony. But then, of course, there's the whole question about this question of Israel's treatment of refugees, it being a country that was created through the creation of many, many hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. So I'm just interested in hearing you talk about Palestinian discourse as you've been watching it on these questions of the relationship between the Israeli-Palestinian relationship conflict and Russia's invasion.
Yeah, I think the invasion has been eye-opening on many levels for Palestinians. It turns out so many Palestinian activists and commentators are saying on social media and elsewhere that the West really does care about international law and the international rules-based order after all, and that it can engage in things like boycotts and divestment and sanctions, and that those things are acceptable tools of foreign policy making. And so it has, obviously Palestinians have pointed out the double standards. And one of those double standards also relates to the treatment of refugees. And I would imagine that Palestinians, I think there's a fair amount of empathy on the part of Palestinians, both for Ukrainians as now an occupied occupation. They're under siege, they're being bombarded, their cities and towns or population centers. People are forced to flee their homes. That is a very familiar experience for so many Palestinians. And so I think at an ordinary public, person level, there's a lot of empathy. But it's also, I think, an opportunity for Palestinians to highlight those double standards. And it, you didn't ask about the Palestinian leadership's position, but there's a gap there between, I think, where many Palestinians are. I haven't seen any public opinion polls, so I can't say with certainty, but I think there's a clear gap where the public is and where the leadership is, which is trying to strike a very similar balance to the one that Israel is. And in fact, they're saying it more explicitly in the Palestinian leadership that, look, we're a weak party here. And sure, occupation is bad. We reject occupation, but we're not in a position to alienate anyone as one of as a non-state actor and as a weak party in this region. And Mahmoud Abbas himself has a long history with Russia in his own personal and political life. He is, what you might call a Russophile, and he spent many years there. So, but also in geopolitical terms, Palestinians are not in a position to alienate either the United States or Russia because of their weak position. I think Hamas is in a similar position, but I don't want to get ahead of myself in the discussion.
Well, let's just stick there. This is really interesting because I think this is not something which has been discussed that much in the U.S. press. First of all, talk a little more about Mahmoud Abbas's Russophilia and how much of it. I imagine it was mostly forged back when it was during the Soviet Union. So how did the Soviet Union at least claimed to be a progressive world actor in a way that I don't think that Vladimir Putin's Russia would. So I'm curious how that Russophilia continues, and also what. One could argue that the Palestinians or anyone is going to alienate one group or another. I mean, you're going to alienate the West if you try not to criticize Russia. So what does the Palestinian leadership have to fear from Russia? What is in their relationship? What is it that Russia could do to the PA Palestinian Authority that it might be concerned about?
Well, I think they recognize that Russia is an actor, is a clear player in the region directly in Syria and elsewhere. But they are also, I think, concerned with, for whatever reason, this leadership still talks about things like the international quartet, the US, Russia, the EU, and the UN, that old mechanism for diplomacy that really, in practical terms, has been defunct for many years, but they still make appeals to the quartet. It's one of the few multilateral, or at least theoretically multilateral mechanisms that still exist in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And so they need to have, on the one hand, a counterweight to the United States. Russia is an important counterweight. The European Union plays a similar role in other ways to counteract America's special relationship with Israel. So they're very much not interested in alienating any of these big powers, and they say so explicitly. As far as Mahmoud Abbas's own background, I mean, he did his PhD. He spent many years there. I think he's even he speaks Russian. Yes, it was a different era in the time of the Soviet Union, but he has maintained those relationships. And right now, he has very few friends in the international arena, and his relationships in the Arab world are strained. He has only a handful of close people you might call allies, like Jordan, Egypt less so, but for the most part, he's very much alone, and he's not in a position to alienate anyone, much less a major power like Russia. So I think it's a similar position that other Arab states, frankly, have tried to stake out, but they've done it in a way that is more quiet. And they can afford to stay quiet because they have the cover. There are Arab states that are closer to the United States than they are. There is Israel, of course, which has a close relationship with the United States, who have this conflicted position, and that gives them a degree of cover that they don't have to be so vocal about it.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I think Americans very rarely tend to think about the Soviet Union as having produced some streak of soft power, we could say, that could even endure decades later. But if you look at the South African government, the African National Congress, they've also been very unwilling to criticize Russia since this invasion. They don't, even though South Africa doesn't have strong economic ties, but I think it also has to do with the fact that literally a lot of those people in that government also were sponsored by the Soviet Union and have somehow transferred that, strange as it might seem in some ways, to this current Russian government. Khaled, maybe you mentioned Hamas, so maybe we should just talk for a minute about how they are responding to this.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas has staked out a similar position as the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, in which they're mostly silent. They're trying to not alienate anyone. They have less of a stake, of course, in terms of alienating the United States. But they don't want to be seen as falling hard on one side or the other. At the same time, so they are, I think, silent in the same way that the Palestinian Authority is. But at the same time, there are some notable expressions of a certain amount of glee on the part of Hamas leaders at what they're calling the end of American domination. And so they very much see this, I think, as a sign that America's influence in the world is waning. And just the fact that America's allies in the region are so conflicted on this really, really underscores that point. And so, but they haven't come out officially, and as far as I've seen, they haven't condemned the invasion, but they also haven't they haven't sided with the Russians the way the Syrian regime has, and a few others.
Elizabeth, one of the subjects that's gotten some media attention is the role of these oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, some of whom have ties to Israel, some of whom even have citizenship in Israel. How much, have they played any significant role in Israeli policy? And I also wonder whether the Israeli government, Israeli societies, I mean, I know not all oligarchs are the same. Some of them have different relationships with Putin than others. But I'm wondering if the view of them in Israeli Jewish society has shifted as a result of since this invasion.
Basically, recently, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid came out with a statement saying that Israel will not serve as kind of a channel to bypass sanctions placed on Russia. This was a concern for the West, obviously, because of these links with oligarchs, some of whom are, could be termed as Putin's cronies. There appears to be today and in previous days kind of a mass escape of oligarchs from Russia. They are, they probably understand that economically it is not beneficial to remain there. I wouldn't say that they have influence over Israeli policy. I would say that the major influence is the traditional influence of the IDF, basically the security establishment in Israel, because of Israeli interests in Syria, is really kind of dominating the conversation inside the government, and therefore guiding the position of the Israeli government.
And one more question, just to stick with you. I mean, it's one thing for Bennett to decide he's going to try to play up, to not choose sides. It's another thing for him to jump into the breach as he has and put himself forward as this mediator, and now playing this significant, potentially quite significant role. Why do you think he's done that? What do you think? And what do you think are the benefits to him, and what are the potential dangers?
So I think that he wanted to exploit this opportunity first because Israel really does have good relations with both Ukraine and Russia, or at least it had those good relations before the war and before this mediation effort slash debacle. And also, I think he wants to appear domestically in Israel as a leader, as a kind of a foreign policy expert, similar to Netanyahu, who kind of this was his brand. He in previous election cycles, Netanyahu would his propaganda would involve him shaking hands with all sorts of leaders, including Putin. So basically, the idea is he wants to appear as a strong leader on the international stage. It appears, however, that either because of his lack of experience or because of bias towards Russia stemming from the relationship that has been established by the Israeli security establishment and Russian officials. Very frequent trips throughout the time of Netanyahu in office, exactly surrounding the issue of Syria and activation of air defense systems in Syria, Russian ones. So it's possible that due to these relationships forged, he may not have even realized to what an extent he's offering something that is quite biased in favor of Russia. This is something obviously that Khaled can probably speak to very well, and has written about how this kind of a very intimate relationship developed over the years between the U.S. and Israel, led them to, be quite a dysfunctional mediator between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah. We're almost done, but I want to ask each of you a little bit about the perceptions, both among Israeli Jews and among Palestinians, of the figure of Zelensky, who's emerged obviously as this very significant global figure. I'm curious for you, Elizabeth. He has this, heroic reputation, certainly, in the West. I wonder, on the other hand, in some ways, I might imagine that for some Israeli Jews, he might be a complicated figure, right? He, after all, is living in Ukraine. He has not moved to Israel. He's a very assimilated Jew, and he does not really speak as a Jew. He speaks as a Ukrainian patriot, which, again, I think for many Jews in Israel and around the world is not something that one expects. And so I'm just curious about the discourse that around Zelensky in particular in Israel.
So definitely the fact that Zelensky is Jewish is something that is almost always mentioned when he is discussed in Israel. That is kind of a central characteristic of his. I think the most interesting aspect of discourse in Israel about him is the fact that Israeli Jews, because of the Holocaust, have quite a negative view of Ukrainians. Anti-Semitism, was rife in Ukraine, to an extent still exists till today. My own grandparents, fled Ukraine during the Holocaust. Ukrainians participated in the slaughter of Jews during the Holocaust. So the image of Ukrainians among Jews in general, Israeli Jews, has been quite negative. And his election to office kind of makes people question, like, oh, maybe something has changed about this nation. Maybe they're not the anti-Semites that we remember from our stories, our grandparents' stories. So his rise to such a high public office has shifted the views of Israelis with regards to Ukrainians in general. If they're capable of electing a Jew, clearly, something has changed about them. And I think that definitely increases the empathy towards Ukrainians, because, of course, anti-Semitism is rife and was rife in Russia as well. but because the Soviet Union was fighting against the Germans, they did not participate in massacres of Jews to the same extent.
Right, right. Khaled, I'm interested in your sense of Palestinian discourse. On the one hand, I could imagine that Palestinians may see a lot to identify in Zelensky in the sense that he's a leader of a now occupied nation struggling heroically against that occupation. On the other hand, my sense from what little I've seen about it is he's not been particularly supportive of Palestinian rights in his time as president of Ukraine. And I think he's going to speak to the Knesset soon. I imagine he's not going to give a speech which would say anything about Palestinian rights to the same things that he wants for his own people. So I'm just curious about what you've seen about Palestinian discourse about him.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think a lot of Palestinians are going to be conflicted about a personality like Zelensky because, yes, he is portrayed as this heroic figure, especially in the Western media, and I think even the Palestinians, those Palestinians who are inclined to be sympathetic with Ukrainians, are going to be a little bit conflicted because, as you said, Zelensky has not been supportive of Palestinian rights and has been quite supportive in the past. At least last May, during the war in Gaza, was publicly supportive of Israeli Israel's military response in Gaza. And those kinds of things, I think, will be used by a lot of Palestinians to justify, or at least they help to mitigate pro-Ukrainian sentiment in a lot of ways. That said, I mean, I think there is a kind of overriding sympathy for ordinary Ukrainians, but once it gets into the political realm, Palestinians become very conflicted, both because of the role that Russia plays and a desire not to alienate Russia, and because of Zelensky is not 100% sympathetic character from the standpoint of Palestinians who feel that why should our sympathy be one way when they clearly don't sympathize with our plight under similar conditions. But yeah, I think it's a pretty complicated picture.
Khaled, I wanted to end with you one last question, which is, it's obviously the world's attention is on the Ukraine right now. It means there's less attention to Israel-Palestine. There's less attention to what happens to Palestinians. I noticed that the New York Times correspondent, for instance, Patrick Kingsley, has been filing pieces with the date lines from like Moldova, right? So he's been yanked out of the region to go help with this. Right. So I wonder if you see anything happening that suggests that the Israeli government might be taking advantage of this relative lack of focus on them, or if you fear that this could be that things may happen during this period of potentially protracted conflict that may be even worse for Palestinians than what usually goes on.
Yeah, there is always that fear. I mean, this was already a low priority and on the international agenda before the invasion of Ukraine. Now it is much more so. So I think there are a number of issues to watch. It would not at all be surprising if Israel sort of stepped up activities in places like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. I think the people who usually follow those issues are following them. But this would be, I think, an opportune moment to move ahead with some of those kinds of measures, like the evictions, the new settlement projects. I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary from the usual kinds of provocations that we've been seeing the past few years. But the longer this Ukraine crisis goes on, I think the more likely that becomes, that we could see Israel pushing ahead on some of those things, with the knowledge that Washington was already not inclined to be very critical, and in any case was dealing with those issues quietly. So that will probably continue. I'm sure American diplomats based in Jerusalem and elsewhere in the region will be talking to their Israeli counterparts on those issues. But yeah, the crisis in Ukraine does not help Palestinians, except those who are interested in using it as a kind of talking point to highlight the double standards.
Right. Well, I think on that note, we're going to close. Thank you, Elizabeth and Khaled, for a really fascinating perspective on these multiple different angles of the different relationships in this really quite frightening and momentous moment. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and you can watch these video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Peter.
My pleasure.